The sun rose reluctantly over Flaxborough, a thin smear of gold struggling through the low, milky clouds. Winchester Hall, a sprawling Georgian manor that had long lost any pretension of grandeur, was hosting the annual town flower show. Marigolds and dahlias fought politely for attention on the long tables in the great hall, while the townsfolk milled about with mild enthusiasm, whispering compliments that were often more obligatory than genuine. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly before 10, tying his overcoat snugly and allowing himself a brief moment of observation. There was something comforting in the predictability of the town's minor events. Mrs. Carmichael, adjusting her hat with quiet irritation, Mr. Fenwick, recounting the same amusing anecdote about a recalcitrant goat, and Miss Toller fussing over her orchids as though their survival rested entirely on her attentions. It was, as ever, a scene of genteel monotony until a faint commotion near the prize dais drew a small crowd. "Oh, my word!" gasped a lady in mauve, clutching her parasol. "The Winchester Hall crest! It's... She faltered, and all eyes turned. There, atop the polished oak pedestal, where the ancient Winchester crest had rested for centuries, lay a small, crudely carved statuette, obviously not part of the display. A minor relic, judging by its size and the faint, acrid smell of wax, yet its presence was somehow immediately unsettling. "Who would dare?" muttered Mr. Fenwick, squinting at it as though it had offended him personally. "Perhaps a prank," suggested the hall steward, trying for a reassuring smile, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the doorway. Purbright approached slowly, allowing the crowd to thin just enough to give him a clear view. The statuette was oddly sinister, despite its diminutive size, a grotesque figure, arms outstretched in a manner that could only be described as theatrical horror. The craftsmanship was crude, but there was a certain deliberate malice in its expression, as though it had been designed to unsettle. "Curious placement," Purbright remarked, not to anyone in particular. His voice was quiet, unobtrusive, yet there was an edge to it that made those within earshot instinctively straighten their posture. One does wonder why it was left here, and why now. Mrs. Carmichael, not to be outdone by the general atmosphere of subdued panic, added, "It's simply dreadful, Inspector. Some dreadful, ill-bred person with no respect for, well, anything at all." Purbright inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her indignation while filing away the details. The hall's doors were all accounted for, the windows fastened. No one had been seen carrying anything unusual in the last quarter hour. Yet here was a strange object, oddly placed, drawing the attention of every attendee. By the time the mayor arrived, puffing ceremoniously in his ceremonial sash, the crowd had begun to speculate in earnest. Some whispered about ancient curses and family disgraces, others blamed children or visiting salesmen. The town's imagination, as always, proved far livelier than the facts. Purbright, standing at the periphery with a small notebook, made no attempt to hasten the proceedings. He observed the reactions, the twitch of a lip, the clearing of a throat, the faint, quick glance exchanged between two gossipy neighbours. Here in the subtleties of manner lay the beginnings of any useful inquiry. As the mayor bumbled through his announcements, half oblivious to the scandalous statuette at his feet, Purbright made a quiet note. The first clue, if it could be called that, would not be the object itself, but the small inconsistencies in human behaviour that trailed behind it like shadows. And so the ordinary town event, flowers arranged with meticulous care, judges nodding sagely, the aroma of boiled cabbage lingering faintly from the kitchen, was quietly disrupted. A seemingly minor, even absurd crime had arrived in Flaxborough, and in its wake the town had begun to stir, not with panic, but with curiosity, suspicion, and the peculiar delight of knowing that one's neighbours might not be quite as respectable as they seemed. Inspector Purbright, adjusting his notebook and tugging at his collar, knew very well that beneath this gentle disturbance, the clockwork of Flaxborough's social order had begun to creak, and someone somewhere had reason to hope that no one would notice until it was too late. By mid-morning, Flaxborough was abuzz with a quiet, yet insistent hum of speculation. The initial shock over the bizarre statuette at Winchester Hall had rippled outward, reaching even those who had not attended the flower show. In the market square, Mrs. Pritchard, who ran the sweet shop on High Street, declared to anyone who would pause and listen that the relic was positively evil-looking, like something from one of those penny dreadfuls. Her customers nodded gravely, or pretended to, while sneaking furtive glances at the clock, hoping for a distraction in the form of sugar or a passing cart. Meanwhile, Mr. Fenwick, true to his lifelong habit, had begun a one-man campaign of rumour-mongering, recounting the incident to anyone who would listen with increasing embellishment. According to his version, which gained rather than lost colour with each retelling, the statuette had been placed deliberately, with malice aforethought, no less, possibly by someone with knowledge of the hall's secret passages. The townsfolk listened, eyes wide, half believing, half indignant at the notion that their sleepy town might harbour such nefarious intent. At the hall itself, the mayor and the steward attempted to restore the semblance of order. They moved the statuette to a side table, placing it between a vase of chrysanthemums and a plate of mildly suspect cucumber sandwiches. Purbright observed this small ritual with interest, noting how carefully they handled the object, as though fear or superstition might render it combustible. Their hesitance spoke louder than any words could, a subtle admission that in Flaxborough appearances were paramount, even over reason. Purbright wandered slowly among the tables, exchanging polite greetings, nodding to the exhibitors, and making the faintest of mental notes about each expression he encountered. Mrs. Carmichael, still frowning in a manner that suggested personal injury, approached him with a brisk gait. "Inspector," she said, lowering her voice just enough to imply intimacy, "surely someone of your experience can see what is truly amiss here. It is not merely the object itself, it is the intent." Purbright inclined his head in acknowledgment. "Indeed," he replied softly, though one might be surprised how often the simplest explanation suffices. Yet even as he spoke, he allowed his eyes to linger on Mrs. Carmichael's hands, which were gripping her handbag with a slight tremor, hardly enough to be noticeable unless one looked for it. Small details, he reminded himself, were the breadcrumbs through which truth often meandered. The exhibit judges, now gathered around a clipboard, murmured among themselves with the subdued urgency of those who wield influence but fear confrontation. Miss Toller, orchids in hand, whispered about a delivery man who had lingered in the hall unusually long the previous evening. Purbright made a note of the name, though he offered no comment. In Flaxborough, gossip was the water in which the town's secrets floated. It was his task merely to observe which ripples led to depth. By noon, the story had migrated beyond Winchester Hall. In the lane leading to the railway station, passengers debated the incident with the precision of court stenographers, each adding and subtracting details to fit their private conception of Flaxborough's moral landscape. Some whispered that the relic was cursed, an echo of past family scandal. Others insisted it was merely a joke, cruel but harmless. Even the station porter had something to say, noting that he had seen a mysterious figure leaving the hall late the night before, though he could not provide a description beyond the vaguest sense of an umbrella and a hat. Purbright, having walked back to the hall for a second look at the scene, noticed that the statuette's position had been altered slightly by a curious child, leaving a faint smear of wax on the oak pedestal. The imperfection did not bother him, Rather, it suggested human interaction, the accidental rather than the deliberate. Yet in that very accident lay a kernel of interest. Someone had been careless, yet not careless enough to be immediately obvious. By mid-afternoon, the initial flurry of whispered speculations had begun to crystallize into more pointed observations. Councillor Hibbert, an official with a habit of wearing beige suits and moral certitude, announced publicly that the statuette must have been placed by someone with a grudge against the hall or its proprietors. His tone carried authority, yet his eyes darted nervously as he spoke, suggesting that even he was not entirely convinced. Purbright filed away the comment with the precision of a librarian cataloguing a rare manuscript. The assertion mattered less than the hesitancy behind it. Other attendees voiced their own suspicions. Mrs. Penrose, who baked with a measure of competitiveness bordering on aggression, suggested that the statuette had been an attempt to sway the upcoming horticultural awards. "If the judges see such an object," she insisted, "they may be distracted, and that would give an unfair advantage." Purbright noted the suggestion with mild curiosity. Human motives were often tangled in layers of envy, pride, and petty rivalry, each layer concealing truths that were seldom dramatic, yet always revealing in their subtlety. By the time the hall emptied, leaving only the organizers and a few lingering visitors, Purbright had conversed with most of the principal players. Mrs. Carmichael, who had taken it upon herself to inspect the statuette for signs of sorcery, Mr. Fenwick, who seemed both proud and anxious about his role as chronicler of events, Miss Toller, whose orchids had been quietly relocated to avoid wax stains, and the mayor, whose preoccupation with ceremonial propriety did little to conceal a flicker of curiosity. Purbright retired to a quiet corner, setting down his notebook and sipping a modest cup of tea from the hall's catering service. He allowed his gaze to linger on the statuette once more. The town, for all its polite agitation, was settling into a rhythm of concern. Gossip had travelled, suspicions were forming, and every person had begun to position themselves in relation to the incident. Yet the puzzle, he reflected, was not in the object itself, but in the undercurrents it revealed: who felt affronted, who was delighted, and who had motives hidden beneath layers of civility. The inspector made a final mental note of the day's events: the statuette, its awkward placement, the gossip that had spread like a careful perfume, and the small anomalies of behaviour he had observed. By tomorrow, he suspected, the town would be divided into factions of opinion, each certain of their own interpretation, yet none possessing the full measure of truth. It was in such moments, quiet and understated, that Flaxborough revealed itself most fully. As he left Winchester Hall, the afternoon light slanting across the manicured lawns, Purbright allowed himself a private reflection. Crime in Flaxborough was rarely loud or violent. Its disturbances were subtle, wrapped in etiquette and social expectation, and the true challenge lay not in catching a perpetrator red-handed, but in discerning which polite gesture concealed intent, which casual remark masked resentment. He folded his notebook carefully under his arm, ready to follow these faint traces wherever they might lead. Outside, a mild breeze shifted the banners fluttering across the town square, carrying with it the faint scent of marigold and curiosity. Flaxborough, in its ordinary charm, had begun to whisper its secrets, and Inspector Purbright, as ever, was listening. The following morning, Winchester Hall seemed outwardly unchanged, yet an almost imperceptible tension lingered in the air, like the hush before a summer storm. The statuette, now encased in a small glass dome, had become a silent centerpiece in the drawing-room. Visitors tiptoed past it, speaking in subdued tones and occasionally glancing at one another, as though sharing a private suspicion. For Flaxborough, this was far more unsettling than any obvious breach of decorum. The unusual object suggested that a hidden narrative was unfolding, and the town, with all its ingrained politeness, was unprepared for intrigue. Purbright arrived just after 9, tipping his hat politely to the steward, who offered a smile that barely concealed an undercurrent of relief. The inspector allowed himself a moment to survey the room, noting the precise arrangement of chairs and tables, the positioning of the statuette in relation to the sun streaming through the mullioned windows, and the faint wax marks at the base that had escaped yesterday's careful cleaning. These were small things easily overlooked, yet to Purbright they provided a delicate outline of human interaction. Who had handled the object, and how nervously? His first interview was with Mrs. Carmichael, who had taken it upon herself to maintain a vigil over the statuette. She greeted him with a brisk nod, her hands clasped firmly over the handle of her handbag. "Inspector, I do hope you have come to make sense of this horrid affair," she said, her voice carrying just the right combination of civility and indignation. "I cannot fathom who would commit such an act, or why." Purbright seated himself across from her, opening his notebook with deliberate slowness. "One hopes to understand more than merely the object, Mrs. Carmichael. Motives, circumstances, and the subtleties of human behavior often prove far more revealing than the item itself." He observed her expression as he spoke, noting the faint flicker of irritation around her eyes, the subtle tension in her jaw, small signs easily missed by anyone lacking patience. She began recounting her movements from the previous afternoon in great detail, when she had adjusted the flowers, how she had seen a slight figure disappear through the hall's side door, and how she had hovered near the pedestal until the mayor's arrival. Purbright allowed her to speak uninterrupted, nodding occasionally, his attention entirely absorbed. It was not that he required these facts in isolation, but rather that the way she spoke, what she emphasized and what she skirted, began to reveal patterns, tiny contradictions that suggested far more than the words themselves. Next, he called upon Mr. Fenwick, who had been the most vocal proponent of the malicious plot theory. Fenwick greeted Purbright with a degree of theatrical cheer, clearly pleased to be treated as a principal witness rather than a mere town gossip. "Ah, Inspector, you have come at last. I trust you appreciate the gravity of the situation, the very audacity." Fenbright gestured expansively toward the statuette, as though it had grown in size overnight. Purbright inquired gently about the events leading up to the incident, allowing Fenwick to embellish as much as he liked. Each exaggeration, each flourish, was quietly catalogued. Fenwick believed himself cunning, yet he revealed a consistent pattern. He had seen several people in the hall the night before, but his recollections were muddled, often contradicting even the casual observations Purbright had made yesterday. The inspector made no overt comment, merely marking these inconsistencies, knowing they would be valuable later. Miss Toller, the orchid enthusiast, proved a more cautious participant. She had been nervous about the statuette contaminating her prized blooms, yet her statements were precise and measured. She mentioned a delivery that had arrived late the previous afternoon, a man carrying a large box and lingering near the rear entrance. There was nothing overtly suspicious, but her attention to minor details, the precise time, the weight of the package, the angle of the sun, began to sketch a framework of events that could either exonerate or implicate unseen actors. By mid-morning, Purbright had compiled a list of inconsistencies and minor curiosities. The statuette's placement, the wax smears, Mrs. Carmichael's agitation, Fenwick's embellishments, and Toller's observations all were pieces of a quiet puzzle, each one unremarkable in isolation, but suggestive when considered together. The inspector allowed himself a small, private satisfaction in the realization that Flaxborough's ordinary veneer was masking the usual undercurrent of petty rivalries and hidden motives. As he moved from room to room, he encountered Councillor Hibbert, who was more concerned with propriety than inquiry. Hibbert insisted that the object represented a moral affront to the Hall, and by extension to the town itself. He suggested that the police force might find it prudent to apprehend a suspect quickly to prevent further embarrassment. Purbright listened attentively, smiling politely, and noted the faint tremor of uncertainty in the councillor's voice. Authority and confidence rarely aligned completely, he thought. Where one faltered, human nature often spoke with clarity. Lunch was a brief, functional affair. Purbright ate sparingly, preferring to remain in the hall rather than retreat to the station. The townsfolk who lingered were careful to avoid direct conversation with him, yet he noted how their glances frequently returned to the statuette. Interest mingled with unease. Each observer, in their own way, was unconsciously revealing priorities, fears, and desires. By the time the afternoon sun angled across the parquet floors, Purbright had begun to form a mental map of relationships and potential motives. Noting, for instance, how Mrs. Carmichael's rigid posture contrasted with Tola's subtle gestures of anxiety, and how Fenwick's performative indignation concealed a certain glee at the prospect of intrigue. Toward late afternoon, he took a brief walk around the hall's exterior, noting minor traces, footprints near a side door, a slightly ajar window that might have been used for ventilation or for entry. The observations were subtle, unremarkable to anyone else, yet they enriched the mental tableau he was constructing. Back inside, he revisited the statuette, now slightly repositioned by a careless assistant. The object itself remained innocuous, yet it was in its interaction with human beings, how they approached it, who touched it, who avoided it, that the mystery deepened. By evening, the hall was quiet. Purbright made a final round, gently probing remarks here and there to gauge reactions. His questions were unobtrusive, a simple inquiry about timing, a casual remark about weather, a polite suggestion regarding floral arrangement. Each response was noted, not merely for content, but for tone, hesitation, and emphasis. There was no rush. The town, he reflected, had begun to reveal itself in its subtleties. The statuette was merely the catalyst. The human behaviours it evoked were the true clues. As he left Winchester Hall under the fading light, Purbright reflected on the day's observations. Motives were rarely singular, opportunity was rarely straightforward. Flaxborough, in its quiet ways, had begun to whisper its secrets. The inspector's mind traced the threads of gossip, observation, and minor inconsistencies, weaving them into patterns that only patience could reveal. Tomorrow would demand more inquiries, more gentle probing, but already the outlines of the truth were beginning to emerge from beneath the polite confusion. And as the town's gas lamps flickered to life along cobbled streets, casting long shadows across quiet doorways, Purbright allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Crime in Flaxborough was never loud or theatrical. It was subtle, polite, and utterly human. And he, in his unhurried, patient manner, was exactly suited to uncover it. By mid-morning the following day, Winchester Hall had settled into an uneasy rhythm, the previous day's stir still palpable, yet muted under a veneer of routine. The statuette, now carefully catalogued and encased in a small display box, seemed almost to exhale an air of quiet menace, though it remained entirely inanimate. Purbright arrived just as the steward was arranging the chairs for a council meeting, giving the inspector a courteous nod that hinted at relief, as though the steady presence of his calm scrutiny could stabilize the lingering uncertainties. The town had already begun to coalesce around a narrative, as towns do when confronted with oddities. Councillor Hibbert, aided by Mr. Fenwick's increasingly elaborate accounts, had quietly identified a suspect. Mr. Bartholomew Crane, the Hall's long-serving groundskeeper, known for his abrupt manner, solitary habits, and long-standing grudges over minor slights. Crane had been observed lingering near the back entrance during the flower show setup, and his reputed temper and occasional quarrels with Miss Toller over the orchid beds were cited as circumstantial evidence. By mid-morning, a considerable portion of Flaxborough's polite society had silently decided that Crane must be responsible. Purbright listened to the conjectures with his customary patience. He allowed others to frame their neatly packaged narrative, recording every detail, every emphasis, every small exaggeration. Yet he withheld judgment. Crane, by all appearances, was the obvious suspect, a man with opportunity, motive, and a socially awkward demeanour. And yet Purbright had learned that in Flaxborough, what was obvious to many often concealed deeper layers. The inspector preferred the subtleties, the contradictions that could not be easily explained by surface appearances. Crane, for his part, was aware of the mounting suspicion, though he said little. When Purbright called upon him, he found the groundskeeper meticulously cleaning tools in the small workshop behind the hall, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his hands steady despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. "Inspector?" Crane said, raising his head with a faint smile. "I'm sure you understand the absurdity of it all. That thing has a look about it, yes, but you'll pardon me if I deny any involvement. I've spent my life tending the grounds, not concocting curiosities for the amusement or alarm of the town." Purbright inclined his head, making a note of Crane's calm yet defensive tone. "Of course, Mr. Crane, one must distinguish between what seems probable and what is certain. I am here merely to understand the circumstances and to clarify minor inconsistencies." Crane nodded, continuing his work, and though his hands were busy, Purbright noted the slight twitch in his right eye when the statuette's arrival was mentioned, a subtle sign of irritation or anxiety. After Crane, Purbright visited Miss Toller, who had returned to her orchids with a preoccupation that seemed nearly ritualistic. She described the late delivery from the day before in meticulous detail, the weight of the package, the peculiar stiffness of the wrapping, and the man who had carried it. She insisted that Crane had not been present, which, while minor, created a fissure in the tidy assumptions the town had already embraced. Purbright's notebook grew heavier with observations, each seemingly inconsequential note forming part of a delicate lattice of behaviour and circumstance. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carmichael, convinced of the moral affront, spoke in increasingly strident tones about the impropriety of the entire affair, her indignation mingling with curiosity. She speculated on who might have grievances against the hall, mentioning distant cousins, past gardeners, and even former curators who had left under less than amicable conditions. Purbright allowed her to speak, mindful that such speculative accounts, while factually loose, often revealed personal attitudes and social allegiances. In a town like Flaxborough, motives were tangled in relationships as much as in opportunity. By noon, the narrative in the town square had hardened. Fenwick was already recounting Crane's supposed misdeeds to anyone within earshot, minor scuffles over misplaced tools, brusque comments to visitors, a single heated argument with Miss Toller about the correct watering schedule for orchids. The pattern seemed convincing, and for those who preferred neat resolutions, the case was closed. Crane, they concluded, had acted from pique or some vague desire for attention, and the statuette was simply the instrument of his minor rebellion. Purbright, however, remained circumspect. He noted the discrepancies. Crane's steady hands during their brief interview, Miss Toller's precise recollection of the delivery, and subtle details in the wax smears that suggested more than one person had interacted with the statuette. His method was not to disbelieve the obvious, but to consider what the obvious did not account for. the absence of certain actions, the presence of unnoticed gestures, the social dynamics that had shifted in response to a seemingly trivial object. That afternoon, Purbright returned to the hall to examine the scene once more. He observed the pedestal, the protective glass casing, and the placement of minor props. He made careful measurements in his mind, noting angles of light, the likely points of access, and the visibility of the statuette from various vantage points. He considered the comings and goings of staff, visitors, and even counsellors. Each movement, no matter how ordinary, contributed to an invisible lattice that framed opportunity, intent, and subtle deception. In conversation with the steward, Purbright gently inquired about minor incidents that might have gone unnoticed, small packages, brief absences, or changes in routine. The steward, eager to be helpful, recalled a fleeting moment when a visitor had paused unusually long near the back hallway before the flower show, a gesture that seemed unremarkable at the time but gained interest in retrospect. Purbright noted it, understanding that such minutiae often proved more revealing than overtly suspicious actions. By evening, the first obvious suspect had firmly emerged in the minds of the town's polite society: Bartholomew Crane. Councillor Hibbert was satisfied that moral order had been clarified, and Fenwick was quietly pleased with the neatness of the narrative. Yet Purbright, walking slowly back through the hall's corridors, reflected on what remained unexamined. There were traces that did not fit the tidy story, minor inconsistencies, the subtle expressions of anxiety and restraint, the gestures that suggested more than one layer of human intent. The statuette had indeed caused a disturbance, but the truth, he knew, lay in a broader web than the simple assignment of blame. As he departed, the shadows of the late afternoon stretching across the hall's gardens, Purbright considered the pattern emerging from his observations. Crime in Flaxborough rarely screamed, it whispered, and the quieter it whispered, the more compelling the investigation became. Crane, the town's chosen culprit, had opportunity and motive in the simplest terms, but Purbright's patient mind, attuned to subtleties, was already alert to the overlooked possibilities, the minor anomalies that would soon demand attention. The true story, he reflected, was yet to fully reveal itself, and the town's tidy assumptions would require careful unravelling before certainty could be achieved. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth from Winchester Hall's gardens, and Purbright arrived with his habitual, unhurried pace. The town's opinion of Bartholomew Crane had solidified overnight, with whispers in the market and comments at the railway station echoing the council's quiet but firm assumption that he was the culprit. Yet Purbright, having spent the past days observing small inconsistencies, had developed a cautious skepticism. Obvious explanations, he reflected, often concealed subtler truths. He began his day with a quiet walk through the hall's service corridors, noting small irregularities: a broom leaning at an odd angle, a slightly ajar cupboard door, and a faint wax residue along a skirting board. Each detail seemed trivial, but to Purbright they suggested patterns of movement, small interactions overlooked by more hurried observers. The statuette itself remained under the glass case in the drawing-room, yet its presence continued to provoke tension. Staff moved with a careful, almost ritualistic vigilance, as though the object's arrival had introduced an invisible hierarchy of suspicion into everyday tasks. Purbright's attention, however, was drawn to a detail that might have escaped anyone else. In the corner of the drawing-room, almost beneath the shadow of a heavy drapery, a single chair had been nudged slightly out of alignment with the others. Its cushion bore a faint impression, as though someone had sat there recently. The position was curious, out of place, yet not so conspicuous as to attract notice immediately. The angle suggested a vantage point from which the statuette could be observed without being obviously involved in its placement. Purbright noted this with interest, making no immediate assumptions, but storing the observation for later cross-reference. He then summoned Miss Toller for a brief discussion under the guise of consulting about the hall's orchids. Her nervous gestures, the way she adjusted her gloves, the careful avoidance of eye contact when the statuette was mentioned, all of it suggested awareness beyond simple curiosity. Toller described a minor anomaly in the flower arrangements from the previous day. A single orchid pot that had been shifted slightly, inconsistent with her meticulous placement. She could not account for the change. Purbright's mind filed the note alongside the shifted chair, recognizing that seemingly insignificant movements often pointed to broader patterns of human behavior. Later, he encountered Mrs. Carmichael in the hall's library. She had taken to pacing while discussing the statuette with the steward, and she noted, almost in passing, that she had observed a fleeting figure near the rear windows the day before, someone bending to examine the wax smears. The observation was so casual that it might have been dismissed by anyone else, yet to Purbright it suggested deliberate scrutiny, possibly by someone who wished to remain unnoticed. He asked no direct questions, allowing her to speak freely, all the while noting the timing, emphasis, and nervous inflection in her voice. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had constructed a mental map of the hall's interior, its traffic patterns and the interactions among staff and visitors. He revisited the pedestal, scrutinizing the angles, the faint wax smears, and the line of sight from the misaligned chair. The light from the afternoon sun fell in such a way that a figure seated there could have observed the statuette without drawing attention. There was nothing overtly incriminating, yet the combination of minor observations, the chair, the orchid, Mrs. Carmichael's passing remark, formed a constellation of curiosity. He walked the garden paths, slowly, noticing a subtle disturbance in the soil near the hedge bordering the east lawn. A small indentation, perhaps the result of a footstep, was faint but consistent. Purbright bent to examine it, noting that it was recent, yet obscured by the morning dew and careful attention to detail. He made a careful sketch in his notebook, aware that the trace might later correlate with observed movements inside the hall. In Flaxborough, such minor traces, invisible to those caught up in gossip and assumption, were often the most revealing. In conversation with the steward, Purbright gently explored the topic of minor deliveries and unexpected visitors. The steward recalled that a small package had been left at the back door the previous afternoon, delivered by a man who lingered briefly, looking unusually attentive to the arrangement of furniture and objects in the drawing room. Purbright noted the description, connecting it mentally with Toller's observation of the shifted orchid and the misaligned chair. The pieces, small and trivial individually, suggested an orchestrated curiosity rather than mere coincidence. By early evening, Purbright had pieced together a tentative understanding of the dynamics surrounding the statuette. Crane, the town's obvious suspect, had opportunity, but these minor irregularities, the chair, the orchid, the fleeting visitor, the footprint near the hedge, hinted at a more complex scenario. Someone else had moved through the hall, interacted with the object, and yet remained sufficiently careful to avoid immediate detection. Purbright's attention to these understated anomalies underscored a principle he had long held. Human behavior, even in polite, seemingly law-abiding towns, left subtle traces that could illuminate motives far more accurately than accusations alone. As dusk fell, he made a final round of the hall, observing staff locking up, checking windows and ensuring that nothing unusual had been disturbed. Each person moved with heightened awareness, suggesting that the statuette's presence had introduced an element of controlled anxiety. Purbright paused by the drawing room, considering the subtle signs of curiosity, hesitation, and deliberate attention that the room's occupants had unwittingly displayed. In that quiet reflection, he recognized the first threads of a test he would soon conduct, a gentle probe designed to observe reactions and reveal concealed intentions. Walking away from Winchester Hall, the town's familiar streets bathed in the warm glow of gas lamps, Purbright allowed himself a measured sense of anticipation. The minor anomalies he had noted, the chair, the orchid, the transient footprint, were trivial to the unobservant eye, yet to him they were the first whispers of a story more intricate than Flaxborough had yet admitted. Tomorrow he would begin the subtle questioning and staged observations that might draw the true culprit into the open, all while the town remained convinced that Bartholomew Crane was the guilty party. And so, with the sun's last light fading behind the distant church spire, Purbright carried with him the quiet conviction that the statuette's mystery would yield to patient observation, delicate interrogation, and an unwavering attention to the understated signs that human beings, in all their civility and subtle deception, could not entirely conceal. The morning mist hung low over Flaxborough, muting the colours of the town and giving even the familiar streets a slightly unreal cast. Winchester Hall, with its Georgian symmetry, appeared almost solemn beneath the grey sky, as though acknowledging the lingering tension its minor relic had provoked. Purbright arrived early, allowing himself a quiet stroll through the gardens before speaking with the staff. He took note of every movement, every glance exchanged between gardeners and assistants, noting small gestures that might hint at anxieties or concealed knowledge. Even the birds seemed to move with a slightly exaggerated caution, as though aware of the human unease permeating the grounds. Inside, the hall was subtly transformed by yesterday's events. The glass case containing the statuette had become a kind of centre around which all activity rotated, whether consciously or unconsciously. Miss Toller fussed over her orchids with renewed precision, while Mrs. Carmichael lingered near the drawing-room doorway, offering unsolicited commentary to any staff who would listen. Even the steward, normally stoic, seemed tense, perhaps aware of how the smallest oversight could now be interpreted as evidence. Purbright observed these shifts with patient detachment, noting that the town's social habits, politeness, deference, and subtle rivalry were now all magnified by curiosity and speculation. He decided that the time had come to widen the circle of inquiry. A knock at the main door preceded the arrival of Mr. Philip Hartley, the Hall's long-time accountant, a man whose tidy suits and meticulous notebook habits made him appear perpetually on the verge of anxiety. Hartley spoke with careful deliberation, offering information about minor deliveries, visitor logs, and unusual entries in the Hall's accounts. While nothing seemed particularly incriminating, Purbright noted the slight hesitancy with which Hartley referred to one recent transaction, a payment to a local antiques dealer that had curiously coincided with the statuette's appearance. Following Hartley, Purbright spoke with Mrs. Penrose, the competitive baker whose presence at the flower show had been marked by restrained irritation at perceived slights. She was forthright, perhaps to a fault, noting that she had observed an unfamiliar visitor at the hall during the previous afternoon, who seemed especially interested in the arrangements of the display tables. Her description was vague: height, coat, and an umbrella, but it carried an odd specificity about posture and movement. The detail was inconclusive on its own, yet Purbright recorded it carefully, aware that in Flaxborough the smallest peculiarities often proved decisive. By mid-morning he had begun to see a pattern emerge. Minor interactions and brief observations that might have been dismissed as coincidence were beginning to interlink. A chair nudged slightly out of alignment, a shifted orchid, the brief attention of a visitor noted by multiple witnesses, and the accountant's hesitant reference to the antiques transaction, all suggested the involvement of more than one person, or at least the presence of a second, subtly influential factor in the unfolding events. Later, Purbright encountered the young railway porter, Thomas Grimes, who had seen the statuette briefly on its delivery, but had remained otherwise uninvolved. Grimes spoke with an almost comical earnestness, insisting that he had seen something odd in the hall's rear corridor, a shadow moving in a manner inconsistent with the staff's routine. Purbright's eyes twitched slightly in acknowledgement. Shadow, movement, timing, all were small behavioral clues that could indicate presence, intention, or opportunity. He asked no leading questions, merely allowed Grimes to speak at length, noting the cadences and emphasis in his voice. By early afternoon, Purbright had begun piecing together a lattice of potential motives and subtle movements. There were those whose pride or envy might prompt action. Miss Toller with her orchids, Mrs. Penrose with her meticulous display planning. There were those whose curiosity was professional or financial, Hartley with his account books, Fenwick with his obsessive attention to scandal. Even Mrs. Carmichael's moral outrage hinted at a personal need to witness order restored, if only to satisfy her own sense of propriety. The statuette, he reflected, was less an instrument of crime than a catalyst, a trigger for these otherwise muted impulses. The inspector returned to the hall's drawing room to examine the statuette once more. The wax smears at the pedestal's base were faintly different from the previous day, as though someone had attempted to clean or rearrange the object with discreet care. Purbright's attention to these tiny modifications, combined with the human behaviors he had observed, suggested that more than one hand had touched the statuette, whether in curiosity, mischief, or deliberate placement. Opportunity, he thought, had to be considered alongside intention, and the alignment of these minor acts often revealed a narrative hidden beneath the town's surface civility. As the afternoon wore on, a minor but telling incident occurred. The steward, while arranging chairs for a brief council meeting, inadvertently brushed against the glass case, leaving a faint fingerprint slightly smudged by polish. He muttered an apology, and Miss Toller frowned at the imperfection, while Mrs. Carmichael's voice rose slightly in reproach. Purbright noted the small tension this provoked, understanding that human behavior under mild stress often revealed patterns of attention, priorities, and concealed frustration. Each reaction, though socially coded, was a subtle clue in the larger puzzle. By evening, the field of inquiry had expanded considerably. What had begun as a tidy narrative centered on Crane now encompassed several townsfolk whose motives, however minor, intersected with opportunity and observation. Purbright walked slowly through the hall's gardens, considering the constellation of details: the chair, the orchid, the wax smears, the hesitant statements, the fleeting shadows. Each minor irregularity suggested not only human curiosity, but also the way Flaxborough's residents allowed propriety, pride, and secrecy to guide their actions. As dusk fell, the gas lamps flickered along the hallways and garden paths. Purbright reflected that the statuette had accomplished more than a superficial disturbance. It had illuminated a complex web of subtle desires, small resentments, and tentative curiosity. The town, still polite and orderly on the surface, had begun to reveal layers of personality that might otherwise remain concealed indefinitely. For the inspector, these layers were where the truth resided, far more than in accusations, assumptions, or the apparent simplicity of a single suspect. Walking back toward the main entrance, Purbright allowed a small, private smile. The investigation was broadening, and the minor anomalies he had collected would soon interact in ways that would clarify the situation. Patience, observation, and subtle testing would reveal the true nature of events surrounding the statuette. Flaxborough, in its quiet, civilized way, had begun to speak, and the inspector, as always, was listening carefully. The morning broke with a low, sullen sky over Flaxborough, the kind of light that seemed to flatten colours and exaggerate shadows. Winchester Hall had regained an outward air of calm, yet the subtle tension that Purbright had noted for several days now lingered, almost imperceptible to casual observation. The statuette, resting beneath its protective glass, continued to dominate the drawing-room's atmosphere, drawing eyes and whispers alike, and reminding everyone that the incident, however trivial in physical terms, had unsettled the town's carefully maintained routines. Purbright began his day with a quiet tour of the hall, retracing steps and checking minor details. The chair in the corner remained slightly askew, the orchid pot subtly shifted, and the faint wax smears at the base of the pedestal had been partially polished but not erased entirely. These small details, when considered together, suggested ongoing human interaction, a continued interest in the object that went beyond mere curiosity. Purbright made careful notes, aware that even the smallest traces could reveal motive, opportunity, or the presence of another observer. By late morning, the first truly surprising development occurred. The hall's librarian, Miss Langley, entered hurriedly, her spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of her nose. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of alarm and disbelief, "you may wish to see this." She led Purbright to the side corridor where the statuette had briefly rested the day before during minor rearrangements. A small painting, part of the hall's permanent collection, had been slashed, the canvas streaked with a neat but aggressive gash, and faint traces of wax smudged along the frame. It was clear that the incident was recent. The varnish remained tacky, and the slight indentations in the floor suggested a deliberate action rather than an accident. The discovery shifted the tone of the inquiry. Whereas previously the object had provoked curiosity and mild gossip, this second event introduced the possibility of intentional interference, even if it was not overtly criminal in nature. Staff and visitors began to speculate aloud, and the tidy narrative that had pointed to Crane as the obvious culprit now seemed incomplete. The timing, the method, and the choice of target all suggested that someone else might be involved, or at least that the situation was more complex than polite assumptions had permitted. Purbright spoke first with Miss Langley, who described noticing an unusual figure lingering near the painting the previous evening, though she could offer only a vague description. Tall, cloaked, and moving with careful precision. She had been on the verge of calling the steward, but had hesitated, fearing she might be mistaken. Her hesitation, Purbright noted, was precisely the type of subtle clue that indicated awareness, discretion, and possibly complicity with social norms. Everyone in Flaxborough seemed invested in appearances, even at the expense of factual accuracy. Next, Purbright consulted the steward, who admitted to a minor oversight. He had briefly left the corridor unattended while attending to an urgent delivery. Though seemingly inconsequential, the lapse created a narrow window during which the painting could have been attacked. The steward's confession, delivered with a mixture of apology and defensiveness, suggested anxiety about responsibility, but he insisted firmly that he had no knowledge of the perpetrator. Purbright filed this information carefully, noting both the window of opportunity and the emotional subtext in the steward's tone. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had extended inquiries to several other witnesses. Mrs. Carmichael predictably expressed indignation over the perceived deterioration of order, while Fenwick took the opportunity to embellish the story further, suggesting a long-planned act of spite by an unknown malcontent. Miss Toller, meanwhile, was quieter than usual, preoccupied with her orchids, but watching the discussions with measured attention. Her reticence, coupled with earlier observations about the delivery and minor disturbances, suggested that she, like several others, might possess information that had not yet surfaced in polite conversation. Purbright examined the painting's frame, noting the neatness of the slash and the way it aligned with the smudge of wax. He considered the possibility that the same person who had interacted with the statuette might have returned to leave a faint signature of their presence, or to test the town's attentiveness. Small behavioral clues, the angle of the cut, the timing implied by the tacky varnish, the minor footprints near the corridor offered more insight than any direct statement could. The inspector then moved to cross-reference these findings with previous observations. The chair, the shifted orchid, the wax smears, the hesitant statements from staff, and now the damaged painting, all suggested a pattern, a deliberate engagement with objects in the hall, performed carefully enough to avoid immediate detection, but leaving faint traces for a trained eye. The interactions were subtle, polite in execution, yet deliberate, implying a knowledge of the hall's routines, the town's social habits, and human expectation. By evening, a tentative theory began to crystallize. The second incident demonstrated that the initial focus on Crane as a sole suspect was insufficient. The new evidence implied either the presence of a second actor or an overlooked facet of Crane's behavior. Purbright's mind worked methodically, connecting minute details, the hesitant glances of staff, the fleeting observation by Miss Langley, the wax traces, and the deliberate misalignment of objects. Each, when combined, suggested subtle manipulation rather than overt crime, a nuanced interplay of curiosity, mischief, and possibly rivalry. In the dim light of late afternoon, Purbright returned to the drawing room. The statuette sat untouched beneath the glass, yet it now seemed almost to dominate the room with silent authority. He noted the reactions of those present, subtle shifts in posture, brief glances exchanged, small hesitations before speaking. The second incident had changed the town's collective attention. Suspicion was no longer comfortably directed at Crane alone, and human behavior, once predictable, was now tinged with uncertainty. Walking back along the garden paths, Purbright allowed himself a quiet reflection. The painted canvas, the wax traces, the shifted orchid, the misaligned chair, all were part of a network of observations that extended beyond the superficial narrative. Flaxborough, so polite, so orderly, had revealed a more intricate web of human motives and subtle interactions. The second incident had expanded the scope of enquiry, and the inspector understood that the investigation would now require even greater patience, careful observation, and a willingness to follow minor clues that others dismissed as inconsequential. As dusk fell and the lamps flickered along the streets, Purbright contemplated the next steps. The statuette had proved to be far more than a curious ornament. It was a catalyst, revealing the hidden tendencies, restrained desires, and subtle deceptions of those who interacted with it. The town's neat assumptions were no longer sufficient. The path ahead would demand careful probing, polite but deliberate testing, and a continued attention to human behavior in all its understated complexity. And so, with the hall's shadows stretching long across the garden paths, Purbright walked slowly toward the main gate, certain that the second incident had not merely disrupted appearances, it had illuminated the deeper, quieter currents beneath Flaxborough's seemingly placid surface, currents he would follow with patience, discretion, and his characteristic, unobtrusive persistence. The evening had fallen quietly over Winchester Hall, leaving shadows to stretch long across the parquet floors and garden paths. The town outside was settling into its usual rhythms, the distant sound of horse-drawn carts and the faint whistle of the railway mingling with the muted voices of pedestrians returning from market. Inside the hall, the statuette rested under its protective glass case, serene and unremarkable to all but the keenest observers. Purbright, seated at a small desk in a side study, allowed himself a moment of reflection, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of his notebook. He reviewed his observations in chronological order, noting the small but telling anomalies: the misaligned chair, the shifted orchid, the wax smears, the faint footprint near the hedge, the hesitations and emphases in witness statements, and, most recently, the damaged painting. Each detail, when considered in isolation, might seem trivial or coincidental. Taken together, however, they revealed a lattice of human behavior, one that suggested deliberate attention, curiosity, and possibly concealed intent. The pattern was subtle, almost invisible to those who relied on appearances alone, yet to Purbright it was as clear as any physical clue. His thoughts wandered to Crane, the groundskeeper, and Town's obvious suspect. The man's steady demeanour, careful movements, and restrained responses during interviews had initially suggested a familiarity with order that could explain minor infractions. Yet the second incident, the painting, presented a complication. It had occurred in a corridor Crane was unlikely to frequent during that period, and Miss Langley's observation of a tall, cloaked figure did not match his description. The neat assignment of blame to Crane, convenient for townsfolk seeking closure, now seemed insufficient. Purbright noted in his characteristic quiet manner that human motivation was rarely singular or linear. Opportunity alone rarely sufficed to explain behavior. Curiosity, envy, pride, and social convention all played subtle roles. As he considered the town's social hierarchy, he reflected on the unspoken pressures and hidden resentments that often guided action. Mrs. Carmichael's moral fervour, Fenwick's enjoyment of scandal, Miss Toller's obsessive attention to orchids, Hartley's cautious accounting, each reflected an investment in propriety, status, and perception. The statuette had acted as a catalyst, illuminating tensions and inclinations otherwise hidden beneath polite exterior. Purbright made careful notes on these behavioral patterns, understanding that they were as essential to resolving the mystery as any physical evidence. He considered the timing of the various minor disturbances. The shifting of the orchid, the chair, the fleeting footprints, and the wax smears all occurred during periods of low observation, suggesting a deliberate calculation of opportunity. Yet they were executed with such discretion that the actors could plausibly deny intent if questioned directly. Purbright's skill lay in interpreting these subtleties, not confronting the obvious, but observing the less apparent, allowing human nature itself to reveal the truth. By late evening, he moved to the drawing room, quietly observing the reactions of the staff and residents present. Miss Toller fussed over her orchids, her movements careful and precise, occasionally glancing toward the statuette. Mrs. Carmichael hovered near the doorway, eyes flicking between the object and the others, her expression a mix of vigilance and moral indignation. The steward paced lightly, aware of his responsibility and the implicit scrutiny. Even Crane, ostensibly under suspicion, moved with steady hands and composed demeanour. Purbright noted each micro-expression, each hesitation, and each brief exchange of glances. These, more than words, provided insight into intent and priority. He paused to consider the nature of Flaxborough itself, a town outwardly serene yet rich in social nuance. The residents, polite to a fault, were adept at masking discontent, concealing personal grievances and maintaining appearances. Yet these same behaviours left subtle traces, gestures, glances, shifts in tone, and minor alterations in routine. The statuette, by virtue of its novelty and implied significance, had drawn these traces into relief. Observing how people interacted with the object revealed more about character, intention, and disposition than direct questioning could ever achieve. Purbright returned to his notes, constructing a tentative mental map of interactions. Who had been present at which times, who had moved objects, who had been visibly curious, and who had remained seemingly indifferent while nonetheless aware. The network of observations suggested multiple actors, overlapping motives and behaviors that could not be easily categorized as either culpable or innocent. Human behavior, he reflected, was often a negotiation between desire and propriety, impulse and restraint. The statuette had merely made that negotiation visible. He considered a scenario in which the second incident had been intended not as an act of malice, but as a test of observation. The precise gash in the painting, the faint wax smudges, and the timing of the act all implied someone curious, deliberate, and perhaps seeking to gauge reactions. The observer was both cautious and meticulous, understanding social conventions well enough to avoid immediate detection. Purbright made a careful note. The actor's familiarity with the hall, knowledge of routines, and ability to remain unobtrusive all pointed towards someone who had long been present in the hall's social orbit. As the night deepened, Purbright allowed himself a private smile. The threads were beginning to converge. The first obvious suspect, Crane, had been useful as a focal point, yet the evidence now suggested that a second presence, subtle, deliberate, and socially adept, was central to the events. The statuette, minor though it appeared, had become a lens through which human behavior could be read, revealing priorities, anxieties, and the sometimes mischievous impulses beneath polite exteriors. By the time he extinguished the study lamp, the outlines of a plan had formed in his mind. Subtle questioning, staged interactions, and careful observation of micro-reactions would soon allow him to differentiate between those acting from curiosity, those influenced by envy or propriety, and those whose actions had been misinterpreted entirely. Patience, discretion, and attentiveness to human nuance would illuminate the true sequence of events. Stepping outside briefly to feel the chill of the night air, Purbright reflected on the quiet genius of Flaxborough's civility. There was a rhythm to human behavior here, one governed by manners, pride, and subtle social competition. The statuette had simply stirred that rhythm, producing faint ripples that could, when carefully read, reveal the deeper truths beneath the town's orderly surface. And Purbright, with his customary patience and attention to understated detail, was more than prepared to follow those ripples to their source. The next morning, Winchester Hall awoke to an unusually bright, crisp light that cut sharply across the hallways and gardens. Purbright arrived early, before the steady rhythm of staff activity began, intent on executing a subtle test he had been contemplating during the previous night's reflections. The goal was not confrontation nor accusation, but observation, to watch patiently and politely how the town's residents responded to carefully orchestrated cues. Subtlety was key. A misstep could alert the guilty party or distort the natural behaviors he sought to measure. He began with the drawing room, arranging the statuette slightly off-center beneath its protective glass. It was an almost imperceptible shift, enough to invite attention without seeming deliberate. Miss Toller arrived soon after, her morning routine carefully timed. She paused at the threshold, eyes flicking to the statuette, then briefly to the displaced chair. Purbright, sitting quietly in a corner, observed her movements with mild interest. She hesitated a fraction of a second longer than usual before straightening the chair and returning the statuette's alignment with meticulous care. The subtle precision of her correction suggested both familiarity with the hall and a keen awareness of minor irregularities. Later, he invited the steward to bring in minor parcels, one by one, under the pretense of reorganizing deliveries. Each package provided a small opportunity to observe reactions. Did the staff notice details, adjust their posture, or glance toward the statuette? Mrs. Carmichael, appearing unexpectedly, stopped midway down the corridor to comment on the careful placement of items, her tone carrying gentle admonition. Her body language was controlled yet responsive. She clearly registered the changes, yet restrained any overt action. Purbright made mental notes of each pause, glance, and subtle shift in expression. The pivotal moment arrived mid-morning when Crane appeared to check on the gardens. Purbright arranged for a casual conversation near the drawing-room, speaking in a low voice about minor hall matters while allowing Crane an unobstructed view of the statuette. He noted Crane's posture, the slight tightening of his hands at his sides, and the careful avoidance of unnecessary eye contact. The groundskeeper's demeanour remained composed, yet there was a tension in his movements that suggested awareness of the statuette's altered placement. Purbright made no comment, letting observation serve as the test itself. As the day progressed, other residents interacted with the hall's interior. Hartley, carrying his account books, paused unusually long at the threshold of the drawing-room, almost imperceptibly adjusting a corner of the rug near the statuette. Mrs. Penrose, who arrived to deliver a cake for the staff's luncheon, lingered near the orchid arrangement, her eyes darting toward the glass case before she commented on the flowers. Even minor gestures, glances, repositioning of objects, hesitations in speech became telling in the context of Purbright's careful observation. By early afternoon, patterns began to crystallize. Those previously suspected or casually observed demonstrated subtle but consistent behaviors, checking the statuette's alignment, briefly noting wax smears, or adjusting minor objects in a way that suggested cautious engagement. Crane's movements, measured and careful, remained limited to his duties, whereas another figure, Miss Toller, displayed repeated micro-adjustments with a precision and focus that went beyond ordinary concern. Purbright's attention to these details confirmed a growing suspicion. The second incident, minor though it appeared, was likely connected to someone whose interactions were meticulous, discreet, and socially aware. Purbright orchestrated a brief, seemingly accidental moment. He requested Hartley fetch a ledger from a side corridor, which passed him directly through the drawing-room. Hartley's eyes flicked briefly to the statuette, and for a fraction of a second he lingered, lightly adjusting a chair leg as though ensuring symmetry. The gesture was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet it was repeated several times by others, each in a subtly different manner. These micro-behaviors, Purbright realized, were revealing both familiarity and careful calculation, a behavioral signature that would guide his ultimate conclusions. Later, Mrs. Carmichael, drawn to the hall by the pretense of examining a minor concern with the lamps, paused near the statuette, speaking volubly about the proprieties of careful housekeeping. Her comments were formal, even pompous, but her eyes inadvertently lingered a moment too long on the pedestal, betraying curiosity or latent approval. Purbright noted the juxtaposition, the outward respectability of speech and the unguarded nature of the eyes. Human contradiction, he reflected, often supplied more information than voluntary confession. As evening approached, he gathered the key participants in the drawing-room under the guise of discussing minor procedural matters related to hall maintenance. Purbright's voice remained polite, neutral, conversational, while his eyes discreetly monitored posture, gaze, and micro-expressions. Miss Toller adjusted the chair again, Crane remained outwardly neutral, and Hartley handled his ledger with evident care. Each movement was a data point, each pause a clue. Purbright's patience allowed him to observe without interruption, letting human behavior speak its own truth. By nightfall, the test had achieved its purpose. Purbright retired to his study, reviewing the day's observations with meticulous care. The patterns were clear. Crane, while present and attentive, had interacted only insofar as his duties required, whereas Miss Toller's repeated micro-adjustments and subtle attentiveness suggested a deeper engagement with the statuette and the hall's objects. Hartley's caution and lingering glances indicated curiosity rather than mischief, while Mrs. Carmichael's moral posturing masked genuine interest. The behavioral signatures aligned, creating a lattice of evidence visible only to the observant eye. In the quiet of the study, Purbright allowed himself a small, private smile. The gentle, unobtrusive test had illuminated the subtleties of human motive without accusation or confrontation. The town's assumptions focused on Crane were now demonstrably incomplete. The statuette, with its minor disturbances, had provoked small but telling actions, revealing priorities, anxieties, and restrained impulses. Purbright's patient method, relying on observation and subtle provocation rather than direct interrogation, had brought the true pattern into view. As he extinguished the lamp and looked toward the drawing-room in the fading lamplight, Purbright understood that the moment for revelation was approaching. The lattice of human behavior was now sufficiently mapped. The time would soon come to bring together observation, deduction, and careful explanation, resolving the minor chaos that the statuette had wrought while preserving the town's civility. The final act, quiet yet decisive, was almost at hand. The morning arrived clear and cool, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Winchester Hall in a way that softened edges and highlighted dust motes dancing lazily in the air. Purbright, as ever, moved with quiet deliberation, aware that the culmination of his inquiries and observations would soon need expression, not as a confrontation, but as a civil and meticulously reasoned explanation. The town's social equilibrium, delicate and carefully maintained, required that the revelation be handled with care, allowing dignity and propriety to remain intact. He began in the drawing-room, where the statuette rested under its glass case, now perfectly aligned, as though expecting the resolution that would soon unfold. Miss Toller arrived first, tending to her orchids with habitual precision, and Purbright noted with mild amusement the subtle ways her attention continually returned to the object. Crane entered shortly after, carrying his customary tools for garden maintenance, and Hartley followed, ledger in hand, eyes flicking occasionally toward the statuette and the minor disturbances that had punctuated the hall's recent days. Mrs. Carmichael appeared last, her posture formal yet expectant, as though she intuitively understood that some explanation of order and propriety was imminent. Purbright seated himself in the study corner, his expression neutral, and began speaking with the soft, measured tones that had earned him both respect and the occasional undercurrent of exasperation. He outlined the sequence of events, describing each minor anomaly with meticulous care: the misaligned chair, the shifted orchid, the faint wax smears, the transient footprint near the hedge, and the subsequent slashing of the painting. He allowed each detail to stand alone briefly, then gradually connected them, highlighting how small movements, subtle attention, and human curiosity had woven together into the disturbances that had drawn the town's scrutiny. The room remained still, the residents listening attentively, their expressions a careful mix of interest and civility. Purbright emphasized that the initial assumption of Crane's sole involvement was understandable given the apparent simplicity of the situation, yet it overlooked the nuanced behaviors revealed through careful observation. Each participant, he noted, had acted in ways shaped by curiosity, social convention, and an innate desire to preserve appearances, behaviors that, when aggregated, produced the anomalies that had drawn attention. He then shifted focus to the behavioral signatures that had become evident during his subtle test. Miss Toller's repeated micro-adjustments of the chair and attentiveness to the statuette demonstrated both familiarity and discreet engagement with the objects in question. Hartley's hesitant glances and careful handling of deliveries revealed curiosity tempered by propriety. Mrs. Carmichael's moralistic commentary, though outwardly stern, betrayed genuine interest in the objects and their arrangement. Crane, by contrast, had interacted only as required by his duties, his movements measured, unimpulsive, and largely uninvolved in the subtler disturbances. Purbright allowed the room to absorb these observations, emphasizing that the statuette had acted less as an instrument of mischief than as a catalyst for behaviors that were already present but ordinarily unobserved. He described how subtle shifts in posture, momentary hesitations, and minor corrections of misalignments formed a pattern, each human action contributing to a coherent sequence of interactions. The second incident, the slashed painting, he explained, was likely the result of deliberate observation rather than malice, a small act intended to gauge attention and provoke minimal reaction without compromising civility. Miss Toller's fingers twitched briefly as she realized the implication, her previous micro-adjustments now placed in context. Hartley nodded slowly, understanding the difference between curiosity and misbehavior. Mrs. Carmichael's expression softened, recognizing that her own attentiveness had been part of the subtle interplay, and even Crane relaxed, evidently relieved that the larger accusation was unfounded. Purbright's gentle delivery, framed as an exposition rather than accusation, allowed each person to retain dignity while confronting the truth. He concluded by linking every minor anomaly, each behavioral observation, and every small disturbance to a coherent narrative: the statuette's introduction, the initial curiosity and minor interventions, the careful observation and micro-adjustments, and finally the second incident, all aligned to reveal a pattern of engagement by those who were most attentive, socially aware and curious. The narrative, while complex, was orderly, emphasizing that no malice had been intended, and that propriety, human behavior, and minute attention to detail were central to the events. The room remained silent for a moment, each resident digesting the explanation. Purbright then offered a final observation, that Flaxborough's civility and careful attention to social norms made subtle actions visible in ways that might escape casual notice, yet allowed a trained observer to read patterns of human behavior with clarity. The statuette in this light was not a catalyst for crime, but for revelation, a mirror reflecting the town's own habits, priorities, and restrained impulses. As the explanation concluded, the drawing room seemed to breathe collectively. The tension that had pervaded Winchester Hall gradually softened. Staff resumed their routines, but now with an awareness of the subtle dynamics that had played out in their midst. Conversation turned to the day's ordinary matters, and the statuette, while still an object of interest, was no longer a source of mystery or speculation. Purbright, having delivered his exposition with patience, politeness, and careful reasoning, allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The sequence of events, minor though they had seemed, had revealed the true interplay of human behavior beneath the town's serene exterior. Walking slowly toward his study, Purbright reflected on the subtle art of observation and the importance of patience in unveiling truth. He had neither rushed nor imposed judgment, instead allowing events, human behavior, and minor details to illuminate the sequence of disturbances. The statuette had been a catalyst, yes, but the true revelations had come from the careful attention to social habits, micro-actions, and the often overlooked impulses that govern everyday civility. Winchester Hall had returned to order, the town's dignity preserved, and the intricate pattern of human behavior once more understood. The morning air in Flaxborough was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and freshly turned soil from the gardens surrounding Winchester Hall. Life for the town had begun to return to its usual rhythm, the minor disturbances caused by the statuette gradually receding into anecdotal memory. Yet for those who had been present during the past week's events, a subtle shift lingered, an unspoken awareness of curiosity, observation, and the quiet revelations of human behaviour. Purbright, meanwhile, arrived with the same measured pace, notebook in hand, prepared to conclude his inquiries with the understated precision that had characterized his investigation from the start. The drawing room was empty when he entered, save for the statuette, now perfectly aligned beneath its glass case. He took a slow survey of the room, noting once more the small marks of human interaction, the faint wax smears at the base, the slightly shifted chair, the indentation near the orchid pot, all minor, almost imperceptible traces that had, over the course of the week, revealed so much about those who had interacted with them. Purbright allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. The town's civility had endured, yet he had quietly observed the intricate web of social habits and restrained impulses that lay beneath. Later that morning, the first visitors arrived. Miss Toller, carrying a small bouquet for her orchids, paused briefly at the drawing-room door, casting a fleeting glance at the statuette before tending to her flowers. Crane followed, checking the windows and ensuring the gardens were in order. Hartley came with his ledgers, moving carefully, and Mrs. Carmichael arrived shortly after, her posture as formal as ever, but softened by the subtle understanding of the events that had transpired. Purbright greeted each with courteous nods, observing the small gestures and micro-expressions that reflected comprehension, relief, or lingering curiosity. Throughout the day, minor conversations occurred, the sort that preserve civility while allowing social cues to resurface naturally. Miss Toller discussed her orchids with Crane, noting their delicate blooms and careful watering schedules, while Hartley commented on ledger entries with precise attention to detail. Mrs. Carmichael, now aware of her unintentional role in the minor disturbances, offered measured observations on housekeeping, ensuring her dignity remained intact. Each interaction was polite, restrained, and underpinned by the subtle recognition that the mystery of the statuette had been resolved without recrimination or scandal. Purbright himself remained largely in the background, circulating gently, offering questions about practical matters and accepting brief replies, all while silently cataloguing behaviours. He observed which individuals took care to maintain alignment in the room, which monitored the statuette without overtly acknowledging it, and which allowed themselves minor indulgences in curiosity. In doing so, he confirmed the patterns he had long suspected, that human behavior guided by propriety and curiosity alike could produce anomalies that, while small, revealed much about character and social priority. By afternoon, the town's attention had shifted outward, leaving the hall to its quieter rhythms. Purbright retired to his study, reviewing his notes with calm precision. The incidents surrounding the statuette had demonstrated that the simplest objects can illuminate the most intricate social dynamics. Minor disturbances, hesitations, and subtle corrections all told a story more reliable than any forced confession. The residents' behavior had been observed, understood, and contextualized, and the truth, polite, understated, and consistent with civility, had been quietly established. As evening approached, the sun casting a warm glow across the hallways, Purbright allowed himself a brief walk through the gardens. The orchid beds were neat, the paths carefully swept, and the air carried the faint murmur of town life beyond the hall's gates. Each element seemed to resonate with the calm order that had returned, yet there remained a quiet acknowledgement, unspoken but understood, that subtle human impulses had briefly shifted the town's equilibrium and revealed the underlying texture of civility. The inspector paused near a rosebush, noting a small petal that had drifted from its bloom to rest against the gravel path. In its quiet placement, he saw the same lessons the statuette had provided. Small events, carefully observed, could reveal more than overt actions. Patience, attention, and gentle observation had resolved the minor upheavals, preserving social harmony while illuminating the truth. Winchester Hall had been restored, and the town, though subtly altered in awareness, continued its measured routines. Finally, as dusk settled and the lamps flickered along the garden paths, Purbright returned to his desk in the study. He filed his notes, each observation meticulously recorded, each subtle interaction accounted for. The statuette remained undisturbed beneath its glass case, and the town's residents, having absorbed the lessons of the week, had resumed their orderly lives. Purbright, with his characteristic quiet satisfaction, reflected that human behavior, observed patiently and without haste, often spoke with a clarity greater than words. The hall settled into its usual calm, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock marking the passage of time with understated precision. Outside, the town of Flaxborough moved on, polite, civil, and subtly aware of the intricacies revealed by a single, small object. Purbright closed his notebook and leaned back, allowing himself the faintest smile, content that observation, patience, and quiet reasoning had restored order without scandal.